Hi everyone, welcome back to the Property Finance Podcast, and carrying on kind of our FAQ series. We get a lot of clients obviously come to us, and we do a lot of talks and things like that, and people come to us and they say, what actually happens if I don't repay a bridging loan? And we'll kind of cover off development finance as part of that as well, because the process is pretty similar. So in terms of the first thing I'll say is communication is always key. So whenever it comes to bridging finance, development finance, anything like that, communication is key. So if you shut down on the lender, they're not going to have any interest whatsoever in helping you, extending the facility, or doing anything to kind of facilitate your needs. So that's the first thing, is communication is key. Now that can either be communication through the broker, or it can be communication direct with the lender, or if you're on development finance, it may be communication through the QS, for example. So any of those routes is fine. It's just a case of communicating to the lender, look, I'm in financial difficulty for whatever reason. It may be that your refinance hasn't come through as quick as you want. It may be that sales are being slow, whatever it is, but you need to communicate with the lender, right, I'm going to be X amount of time late. That's where the second bit comes in key. And that's when you're communicating with the lenders, you have to be communicating with facts. And I think that's where a few people that we've seen recently, a few clients, and even just people I know of in the industry who've struggled, if they're starting to struggle with their bridge or their development finance, they're getting to the point where they're not communicating with facts, they're communicating with emotion. And I've had a few, recently a client, interestingly, said to me, like when I'm talking about deals or finance or anything, I become quite emotionless. And the reason why you have to be emotionless is because the minute you bring emotion into it, everything falls apart. And what we tend to find is that if you speak to a lender in facts, figures, timescales, they're happy. They will work with you. If you start talking emotion, you start becoming quite heated or even quite sort of sad or emotional about things, they're not going to facilitate. This is a very cutthroat business. Bridging and development finance is very cutthroat. And it's very much business is business, personal is personal. Everything kind of gets very clearly separated. So when it comes to asking for an extension or trying to avoid going into default, it's a case of going to the lender and saying, right, I'm going to be 3 months late. I'm going to be 3 months late based on this, laying out the facts. I am going to be able to repay it on this date because of X, Y, Z, and being able to prove, right, okay, I'm now doing this, which is going to enable me to pay this back. So let's say you've got a small development, for example, and you might say that you're going through sales and your sales have been delayed, and you may have to then go down refinance instead. And it may be that, let's say that small development is a series of sort of small semi-detached houses and sort of proper rental stock, and you might be able to say, right, okay, I'm going to go down the refinance route. Well, then it's a case of when you approach the lender saying, right, we've tried sales, we're going to be late because of this. We're now going to pivot into refinance. So based on that, we've got the valuation for the refinance booked in, everything else, the refinance is with X lender. It's going to take them this long to do it. Here's the process. We're going to keep you updated throughout. And that's how you sort of go and say, this is the date that it's going to be. That's how you kind of negotiate an extension, I would say. So communication, timescales, they're key for getting through an extension. And those extensions normally will be 3 to 6 months, and they're normally going to cost you 1-2% as a fee. And then potentially your interest rate may go up, although we've tended to find with extensions that the interest rate sort of stays the same. Let's say you're then moving on to default. So let's say you've run out of your extensions, you've run out of favors from the lender, you're into default territory. So when you sort of ask the question of, what do I do if I can't repay my bridging or development loan? Well, if you go into default, that's where you start to get into the area where you're going to struggle to get out of. And the reason I say that is because when you go into default, your interest rate normally skyrockets, your fees normally skyrocket. So it's a case of, before you get to that point, trying to refinance to something else. Now, if you're on development finance, you might refinance onto a sales bridge, for example. If you're on a bridging loan, you may just refinance to another bridging loan. But it really is key at that point to kind of refinance before you get into default, because that is the point where if all of a sudden you're on a default rate of 5% a month, which some of them are, if you've borrowed £1 million, all of a sudden you're talking about 50 grand a month coming out, which is a humongous amount of money. I mean, you talk about if you're on default for 3 months, that's 15%. it's just gone out the door straight away. I mean, that's almost what you'll have paid for a year, maybe 18 months of having that facility before. So that going out the door is just an absolute no-go. If you then start adding in default fees and everything else, again, just really kills it. So if you know you're about to go into default, get it refinanced as quickly as possible. The other thing as well is that if you're about to go into default, maybe you haven't got time to refinance, you could say to the lender, look, we're about to go into default. We don't want to go into default because obviously we don't want all of these fees. Could we please refinance? And could you allow us maybe a couple of weeks to do the refinance? And that's where maybe private investors are going to come in and that kind of thing to pay it off as quick as possible. So we've kind of spoken through the best case scenarios. So we know how we can go about doing extensions. We know how we can get out of a default potentially. Let's say you're now talking worst case scenario. So you've gotten to the point where you're just stuck. You can't refinance. You can't sell. You're stuck. You've gone through default. You've done all your extensions, everything else. At that point, you're pretty close to the point of no return. So what will then happen is that the lenders will essentially issue a formal demand. They'll issue a formal demand on the basis of, right, we need our money back within 14 days. Some may be less than that, but most will allow you 14 days. You've then got 14 days to try and refinance, bring in a private investor, something like that. So you've got a very small window to kind of save your life, if you like. If you get to the end of that 14 days, what then happens is that formal demand, it then turns into essentially appointing an insolvency practitioner or essentially an administrator to come in. And what they will do is the lender will then take possession of that site. So what will happen is they will then essentially take over the day-to-day running of the site or property, take control, change the locks, everything else, like just take full-on control. And the problem is because it's an unregulated market, there's very little you can do. There's no big court case. There's no big hoo-ha about, oh, you can't do that, you can't take this. It just happens. So there's very little you can do in those scenarios. Obviously, take legal advice, all the usual stuff. I'm not a solicitor and I'm not going to tell you what you can and can't sort of get away from a legal perspective. But at that point, when they've taken possession, that then is when your involvement becomes zero. So it then becomes a managed process by the lender. The lender then will sell on the property. And then what will happen is if there is any shortfall at that point, what will then, and before I sort of talk about that, what we tend to find is clients have this, we've only ever had it happen twice. So we've had two clients in 8 years who have got to this point, both of whom we've saved. So neither have actually gotten to the point of sort of being in real trouble, but two have had administrators appointed. Now, in both scenarios, the client's initial reaction is, oh, I'm just going to throw the keys back. Have it, take it, I don't care. I'm not bothered anymore. Like, just take it, sell it. You'll get paid back from that. There seems to be this misconception that if a lender takes repossession, that they're guaranteed to get their money back. That isn't the case. Because what happens is you have massive fees from the administrators, insolvency practitioners, default interest, everything else. It all racks up. And what you tend to find is actually the lender may not be able to sell that property to get all of their money back. So what then happens if they sell it for a loss, you've signed personal guarantees. So every loan that you take in a limited company, whether it be a bridge, development loan, buy-to-let, refurb loan, whatever, you're always going to sign a PG. Now, in most scenarios, that PG is going to be limited, maybe to 10, 15%, maybe 25% of the total loan. Some will take up to 100% of the loan, but most of the time it's capped. But what will happen is they will then go after that PG. So if, for example, you've got a loan of £1 million, they sell the property for 900 grand, they've made 100 grand loss, they're coming after you for that £100,000. Some lenders may, if they've made that 100 grand loss, might look at it and take it on the chin. Very, very unlikely they will, though. So you have to be prepared that they're going to come after personal guarantees. You do not want to get to that stage. So there are, as you can see, plenty of stages before you get to that point. I would say if you get to the point where you've had an administrator or an insolvency practitioner appointed or lenders taking possession, you have failed at a number of stages in order to get there. And I don't think it's unfair to say that. You failed at the point of trying to get an extension. You failed at the point of trying to renegotiate a default. And then you failed at the stage of trying to negotiate your way out of going into administration. You've had numerous points where obviously you could have saved that. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some scenarios where people just cannot get away from this situation. So, for example, in the two that we've had, one had a lease from a supported living provider. Many of you will have seen on social media, there was a supported living provider who then ended up being sort of taken to court and criminal proceedings against them. They had a lease on this property. The property was worth about 2.3 million with this lease in place. Without this lease in place, it was worth about 1.3 to 1.4 million. You can't control that. There's no control on that. But it also highlights a big issue and a big bubble within that sector. But I'll do another podcast on that. So that was out of the client's control. They unfortunately had a lease with a provider who turned out to be bad. There's nothing you can do there. In the second scenario, it was a developer who one of the directors had taken a significant sum of money out of the company and then resigned, gave shares back, everything else, and disappeared off the face of the planet. There's nothing you can do in that scenario either, other than try and stop them taking the money, but it's already happened at that point. In both scenarios, you've got something which is completely out of your control. Even with communication, there's nothing you could have done. In scenario number one, we managed to negotiate that they kept hold of the property and kept working with the lender and essentially tried to manage their way out of it, which, to be fair, touch wood, seems to be going all right at the moment. But again, that was the lender kind of recognising that it wasn't the client's fault. In scenario number two, what we've managed to do is actually find the client a couple more sites to purchase. They've then added those into the pipeline and essentially will then manage their way out. So actually, in a weird way, this developer has kind of gone a bit belly up on a few, I think it was 3 sites in total, but actually by adding another 2 sites into the mix, he can sort of manage his way out. So in a weird way, you might have to buy more to save the journey. But again, it's kind of different for everyone who kind of works on it. But it sort of shows you that sometimes you just do not have control as to whether or not you're going to kind of go down this route. But hopefully that gives you a fairly good idea of the stages that lenders will take in order to sort of repossess, if you like, but also the stages of negotiation you can go through to stop that happening if you can't repay your bridge or development finance. But I think to wrap all of that up, I mean, it's a fairly chunky podcast, but actually it all comes down to one thing, which is communication. That's literally the only thing that matters, is just pure communication and keeping to facts. And I think if you can do that, chances are you won't end up being in the situation that these guys have found themselves in, because there's always a way, or normally always a way out of anything. So if you find yourself in trouble, communicate, and there should be a way of navigating that. Because bridging and development finance, they're 2 great products, but they do have obviously those risks, and people inherently have put a negative spin on a lot of that. But there's always a way of navigating that. So hopefully it was helpful. If you have enjoyed the podcast, please leave a review, share it on social media, do all the usual stuff, get it out there for us, because it's great for, especially these educational ones, for people to see this. And I'd love for as many people as possible to be able to listen to this and avoid going into these dangerous situations that others have found themselves in. But thank you very much for listening. Catch you on the next one.